I am happy to introduce today's keynote speaker, Natasha Levinson. Dr. Levinson is a highly regarded international scholar in philosophy of education. She is Associate Professor of Philosophy of Education and interdisciplinary professional and she's an Associate Professor of Philosophy of Education and Interprofessional Studies in the Cultural Foundations of Education program at Kent State University, Kent, Ohio. Dr. Levinson is a long-standing member of the US-based Philosophy of Education, PES, and currently she is the Executive Director. She is a sought-after invited speaker, keynote, discussant, and reviewer in multiple forums as conferences, symposium, roundtables, and editorial boards. She has published articles in philosophy of education, studies in philosophy and education, teacher college record, and educational theory. A foundational work on conceptualizing education from an Arendian orientation, and her thoughtful deliberation on and attuning to the essence of education and how it might contribute to a more just and sustainable world without succumbing to instrumental notions of education are extremely relevant and time-bound. Professor Levinson suggests that a best and least public work emerges in the increasing online spaces of teaching that allows time and space for working through concepts and difficult educational emotions. Today, she is going to consider futility as a generative concept of thinking on education's qualities, limits, and potentialities. We are thrilled to have her here in our face-to-face gathering. Will you join me in welcoming Professor Levinson?
So much. I don't think you'll see me if I'm there.
I was just going to say, apparently the audio, I don't know if we were going to need a microphone. We're a pretty small group. So, but I don't.
Teach a voice.
Okay, perfect.
I also have an accent, so if you can't understand anything I'm saying, just flag me. Say it slowly or something, especially with some of the articles that I'm citing here. So first of all, thank you for coming. It's really nice to see humans. I don't get that much anymore. And thank you very much, Paul, for inviting me. And I'm very excited about this whole weekend. And also, I hope I get this right, the Office of Institutional Research.
Just office, the research office. Yes.
Thank you to the research office for facilitating this event. Okay, so the first thing I have to announce is the thing that people always, it's never a good sign when they tell you this, but that's no longer my title. So Paul mentioned to me that the dean was no longer going to come, and I was like, yes. You don't have to be so bright-sidey. I can just tell you that this is not about anything. Well, it's not quite so positive. Is the dean here?
I should say, sorry, I did mean to say that Dean Donna also support the larger event. If you're sticking around, if you're just here for the keynote, fine, no problem. If you're sticking around, if you register for the day, it's Dean Donna that sort of stepped up and got us our lunch today. So I do want to say that. And in the research office, where they got the visiting scholar grant that allowed us to bring Natasha here. And so thank you.
Yes. None of that is ingratitude. It's just the real title of the title of the paper is The Paradox of Educational Futility. And of course, it's a dismal title. And administrators don't like dismal anything. So anyway, that's what it is. So I'll just get into it. So there's a feeling of futility in the air. A sense that education isn't doing what we ask it to do, that it's not fulfilling our expectations. Education is perpetually letting us down. It's a permanent source of disappointment. On the other hand, the concept of futility contains, so futility there means just sort of like, oh, what can we do? It's that sort of sense of helplessness. On the other hand, the concept of futility contains within it the seeds of a critique of the idea that education must be useful in order to be valuable, that its outcomes must be tangible, that it must produce results. So a recent lead article in the Chronicle of Higher Education was about the need for a new narrative in higher education. And it suggests that we understand that education, we're coming to understand that education is no longer a guarantee of a better job or indeed even a starter job. Many colleges are starting to double down on the old message, although some are now scrambling to adapt to this new reality by downscaling promises. The new emphasis is now to talk about how college can position students for an uncertain future. So we're not making promises, but the residue of neoliberalism has its sticky hold on us. The message is clear. College can perhaps maybe be of use, but the onus is now on the student to succeed. So college is now marketed as a possible tool in the arsenal of potentiality. David Blacker is right. Education has yet to catch up to new economic and social realities of this post-work era. Blacker's devastating question is what to do with the new class of expendable people in all age groups and increasingly across the class spectrum, which, by the way, includes those of us who work in higher education, and may, if proponents of AI have their way, displace classroom teachers too. This is very dismal. We're still making promises in part because we don't have a paradigm for this new era, which may not be an interregnum, but a new social reality. Neil Vallely has named our predicament utilitarianism, and he announces a new figure of man. He calls it this figure Homo Futilitas. At one extreme, Homo Futilitas are those who are no longer needed. They're the economically expendable people, and they're considered to be a drain on the state, surplus to requirements. At the other end of the spectrum are those who literally buy into the narrative, the neoliberal narrative of self-sufficiency, in the belief that it will stave off the likelihood that they too will be sidelined eventually. These are the dreamers that colleges hope to lure back to education. And in between are folks who engage in what Vallely calls a politics of futility, convincing ourselves that our bags for life will offset climate catastrophe. Vallely describes the problem well, but then he does this thing that critical social theorists always do. He bounces from this bleak vision to a call for the development of a collective consciousness, capable of pulling together these disparate constituencies. He takes a cue from Guy Standing's concept of the precariat, which similarly hoped to turn an economic predicament into a politics. Vallely names this new political force the futilitariat, and he suggests that if we can come to grips with the meaninglessness of utilitarian existences, in which every action is undertaken not for its intrinsic value, but for the promise of a payoff, we will create the conditions for more meaningful lives. This paper inserts education into Vallely's analysis of the futilitarian condition, not because I think that education can offset this condition, but because education is a place where we learn to live in this condition. In this sense, I don't think that futilitarianism is a problem to be overcome as much as a condition that we need to understand and reconcile ourselves with. So I turn to Hannah Arendt to make this case because she offers a way of understanding how coming to grips with futility can help us live meaningfully together in a shared world that feels as though it's falling apart. It also accords with her general analysis of human beings as conditioned and conditioning. We're shaped by the world we inhabit, and we're capable of reshaping it. So this next section is called Only a Feeling. And I turn to this question of feeling partly to signal a therapeutic dimension to attending to futility, actually doing this kind of, it's going to make you feel better in some way. if we understand therapy the way Smayers and Smith and Standish understand it, not as the search for a cure or for the sake of making people more adaptable, but in the sense most closely connected to education, which is to say therapy in the service of understanding. Futility is a laden concept, and this is evident when we think about Camus. So you've seen the paintings of usually a muscular figure with a boulder on his shoulders, and he's carrying or rolling the boulder up the mountain, and then, of course, it tumbles down again. Petra McCullen and Taylor Webb write about the ways in which education is steeped in what they call Sisyphusian economies. I pronounced that. That was, but it's a great phrase, right? Education understood to be failing its mission of doing the heavy lifting for society, propelling economies, spearheading social transformation. This paper attempts to do something different. It's less a repurposing of education, prompted by a desire to insist once again on the utility of education, even if it now comes with fewer guarantees, and more a matter of release into the futility of education. So as a counter to the heaviness of the myth of Sisyphus and the images that we've inherited, I want to tell you a little bit about a very short film by Liza Johnson called In the Air. That's actually still available on the Wexner Art Center website. It's the Wexner, the Epstein Wexner. That's the limited guy, Victoria's Secret. But anyway, he funded this amazing art center in Columbus, and during the pandemic, they put Liza Johnson's film online, and thank goodness they have not taken it down yet. I'm very grateful to them for that. I came across this, I'm going to tell you about this film, but I need to tell you that I came across it not because I was looking for all things Wexner, but because Simon Berlant has written it up really beautifully in a very short essay called Austerity, Precarity, Awkwardness. It's a very short essay. You can find it online. I don't know where she actually published it, but my reading of this film is indebted to Lauren Berlant. So the film is set in Portsmouth, Ohio. It's in Southern Ohio. It's set shortly before the 2008 banking crisis. And Portsmouth, Ohio was also at the center of the opioid crisis. And it actually features in Sam Quinonas's book on the opioid crisis called Dreamland. And the camera follows 4 teenagers around the town, this dismal town that hasn't quite recovered from its post-industrial condition. It's sort of, the trouble with post-anything is the what comes next, right? So it's still post-industrial. It follows these 4 teens sort of ambling through the town in a series of episodic sequences that capture the imploded dreams of this post-industrial era. So what is in the air? Well, we see in the town decaying and broken infrastructure. Just, walking down the road, you see the concrete sort of falling apart. You see stores in various states of decay, and no one is rebuilding, no one's investing in the town. The teenagers are bored, and there's a sense throughout the film that they and we are not getting anywhere. There's a continual sort of back and forth motion. It's a trope in the film. So there's one where one of the teenagers is working at a fast food store, at the fast food window, and she's bored, and she just presses a button and the window goes back and forth and back and forth. There's another scene where a child is swiveling back and forth on a bar stool. And he sort of wraps himself up. He zips up the front of his hoodie so you can't see his face, and he's just swiveling back and forth while his mother is sitting next to him on a stool, day drinking. And every now and again in this film, amongst this kind of largely aimless movement, the back and forth movement is punctuated by a cartwheel or a backflip or an unexpected spin around a street lamp. And these movements hint at a different rhythm in which the unexpected moves disrupt boredom and stasis that pervades the film. And then eventually the film focuses our attention on the only communal space we see in the film, an acrobatics class that's taking place in the town. And that seems to be the one going concern in the town. The other sort of business that we see, aside from the fast food place, is aptly a recycling plant. Although we don't see the metal being crushed for the presumed sake of repurposing the metal, building something new. Instead, all we see is another back and forth motion of the scraps of metal being moved from one section of a warehouse to another section of the warehouse. A symbolic exercise in futility. In the space of the circus class, the young people are learning acrobatics. And Berlant says, not to become professional performers, but simply to move their bodies. The circus school is a social space. It's a gathering space for teens who learn to fall. They learn to fall on the mat. They fall for one another. They have these adorable crushes. They experience failures. They try again. They support one another through difficult moves, spotting one another as they attempt backflips, climb up vertical ropes, and practice aerial routines. So again, up in the air. And the important thing is that the circus school is not presented as a site of cruel optimism. The students aren't climbing these ropes to seek fame and fortune. The circus school offers release and boredom in a disillusioned present. It's a time to be together, to challenge and support one another through movements that are momentarily uplifting, but don't get the young people out of Portsmouth anywhere further than where they are. So a little caution here. I'm not offering here a celebration of futility. There is still an emptiness at the core of the concept. If futility had an anthem, if it had an anthem, emphasis in the past tense, it would perhaps be Peggy Lee's Is That All There Is? Although that post-war sense of ennui in the midst of a life of abundance has been replaced by something between disappointment in the wake of cruel optimism and a growing sense that this is all there will be for the foreseeable future. Camus tells us that Sisyphus decides to be happy, but this feels at once too in sync with the culture of residual bright-siding and decidedly out of sync with these bewildering times. What is needed is less an attitudinal shift than a structural and semiotic conception, plural, structural and semiotic conceptions that accord with our new social realities. In other words, we need to think more clearly about our messaging as well as our systems. Lauren Berlant writes about the difficulties of naming the stage of the crisis that we're at, the crisis in which we find ourselves, in part because we're living through it. They are our historical present, and in part because the crises that brought us to this point have become ordinary. So ordinary that it seldom registers as the type of crisis that's up to the task that Arendt sets for crises, which is laying bare the essence of the matter so that we can come to understand what we're dealing with, what it is we need to preserve in the midst of and become untenable. One way that a shift in the crisis ordinary registers is affectively. A crisis ordinary registers as, quote, a disturbance in the reproduction of life. There's a shift both in the norms of comportment in the world at the micro level of expectation and relationality, and in structural terms, as the state loses its bearings in governance and the regulation of persons and markets. A crisis ordinary feels like stasis, and yet we stumble along, seeking support in infrastructures in, quote, the interregnum of hesitation when the relation of living to a fantasy of life has to be reinvented. Now, Lauren Berlant died a few years ago, and she wrote this essay around the time of the 2010s. We may be on the verge of a crisis extraordinary, fueled by job losses due to AI, but we won't know it until it affects more of us. So now I'm turning to the paradox of, so that's the situation. So it's supposed to be lighter than Camus because it's the circus school, but it's pretty dismal. So now I want to walk you quickly through the paradox of futility in the human conditions, and I'm walking you through Arendt's book, and this will all be very familiar to all of you. So I may go pretty quickly through it. Futility is an ambivalent concept in Arendt's work. On the one hand, it's the backdrop against which all human endeavors and interactions take place. Our lives are an attempt to escape the condition of futility. The ancient Greeks, in fact, were so disdainful of labor that they sought to outsource it to people they deemed unworthy of more meaningful lives. And the reason the Greeks established the polis was to create a distinctive space in which people could free themselves from the demands of necessity and give shape and meaning to the shared world. But the polis was not immune from the problem of futility. As a space of appearance, it is ephemeral. Words that were spoken disappear as soon as they're uttered. Deeds are quickly forgotten. The battle against futility prompted the Greeks to search for modes of remembrance that could lend a measure of permanence to fleeting engagements. But the artifacts and memorials they built were also always in a battle against the ruin of time. They are subject to decay and have to be maintained in order to stave physical disintegration and cultural amnesia. These acts of care are a perpetual battle against oblivion. Political action is even more difficult to pin down. Actions, once initiated, are unpredictable, not linear. Political action seldom accomplishes what was intended because of other people, right? You start something, someone else says something, someone else does something, and before you know, it's widened and broadened and perhaps dissipated, right? That's why we can't be activists all the time for the entirety of our lives. It's exhausting and frustrating and always disappointing. We engage in activism intermittently, right? The Roman solution to this problem was to reduce politics to policy in order to ensure that political initiatives achieved what they set out to do. I'm looking at a policy person when I say this. The problem is that this instrumentalization of the political realm mistook what is essential about this domain of the vita activa, the capacity for the unexpected to happen. The attempt to combat the futility of action undermined what is unique in this mode of existence and what is essential about it, which is its unpredictability. The capacity for human action and actors to intervene in processes that seem automatic and inevitable and unquestionable. Our capacity to defy expectations in order to set the world aright, to make it possible for something different to happen. So that's politics. Toward the end of her life, Arendt turned her attention concertedly to the elements of the vita contemplativa, the contemplative life, that similarly struggle with futility. Thinking, which is largely internal and doesn't make an appearance in the world, and judgment, which is how thinking manifests in the world, are both always provisional, no matter how much certainty accompanies the pronouncement of these judgments. Thinking is more futile in the sense that it doesn't result in anything. And here Arendt makes a very important distinction for us between cognition, which builds thoughts into a system, and thinking as Arendt understands, which is largely negative in two senses. Firstly, it's not visible to the world. It's not made manifest in the world. And secondly, it's negative in the sense that she says thinking tells us what to do. It's not productive in the sense that we think a thing and then we enact it in any simple, straightforward way. Thinking, she hoped, would stop us from acting stupidly or meanly or cruelly. So thinking is negative in that sense. Judgment is the way that thinking makes its way into the public realm. It's a temporary release from endless ratiocination. But no sooner have thinking people come to a conclusion than we start to second guess ourselves, which propels us back into the unproductive but ethically significant world of thinking. So futility is an ongoing challenge. It's a reminder that the persistence of the human world is contingent on the actions we take. Contingent is the key word. And futility is not a condition that can be overcome. At best, it can be held at bay. We need to get better at learning to live in this condition because efforts to eradicate futility imperil what is human about the world. The fact that things decay and fade out of memory is an invitation to think about what matters and take steps to preserve what would otherwise be forgotten at a particular time, in a particular place. Just lost mine. It is also an opportunity for reinvention as well as remembrance. Futility also draws attention to the need for judgment. Not everything will be deemed worthy of being preserved and passed along. Each generation will rediscover the past anew. Historical continuity is punctuated, not linear. There may not even be such a thing as historical continuity. That's a question. Arendt is famously very critical of any notion of progress. So this idea of futility, the kind of cyclical nature of it, features in part of her critique of progress. Arendt's strongest embrace of futility emerges in her critique of the contemporary overemphasis on utility as the measure of all things. And here, futility becomes a positive term, a reminder that trees are not simply wood, and wind is not simply a natural resource to be harnessed for our use. Futility draws attention to the many dimensions of existence that are valuable in and of itself, independent of their utilitarian function. The concept of futility is thus a spur to meaning-making and a reminder that our efforts to make meaning must take care not to instrumentalize the world or those with whom we share it. Futility is Arendt's term for that which must continue to lie beyond our desire to control and determine human interactions. Conversations that dissipate and leave no lasting record are a good example. Think of any seminar that you've ever engaged in that was a successful seminar. Unscripted and unpredictable action is another manifestation of potentially futile undertakings that are as likely to disappear as to affect change, but they matter for what they bring to the present and for what they bring into presence. So I have 2 more sections. How am I doing on time? I'm okay?
This is in form of, it is, free space. If you need to go anywhere, go. You take your time, and then we'll have some questions and discussion. And the program's very malleable.
Okay, good. That seems appropriate. So this section is called Education and Futility, and there's a slash between the F and the U, so it's futility. So a great deal of Arendt's scholarship, including some things that I've written, focuses on how these aspects of the vita activa feature in education. And much ink has been spilled trying to ascertain whether education is a form of labor, work, or action. And this exercise is not without merit. If education is largely labor, then we gain insight into why it is devalued. As labor, education doesn't produce anything tangible. No wonder education is seen to be futile, reproductive and largely custodial rather than productive. Which is why education has increasingly been seen as a form of work, as Arendt understands the term. So the point of work is to produce something, particular kinds of workers, hence qualification in Geert Biester's terminology, particular kinds of citizens, socialization in Biester's terminology, or particular kinds of subjects in Foucault's sense, not in Geert Biester's sense of the term. Students approach education similarly, as an investment from which they must reap rewards in order to justify debt. This way of understanding the purpose of education is valued because of its utility and its tangibility and measurability, so return on investment. It's also why education has lost its way and no longer speaks to our current economic predicament. If education is, because if there's no work and we're preparing people to be workers, right? And also if the state is glitching and is unable to fulfill its functions, its governance functions, it's very hard to convince students what it means to become a good citizen, right? If education, on the other hand, is largely a form of action that aims to create subjects capable of living together in a shared world, we can see the appeal. Although harnessing action to Geert Biester's conception of subjectivization blurs the line between political action and education that Arendt insists on. So even the most gentle insistence on subjectivization has the potential to make students susceptible to instrumentalization. You may not literally be telling them how to be in subjectification or under the conditions of subjectification, but you are sort of creating a space designed for them to demonstrate their capacity for subjectivization. And so there's a little bit of a trap there. I can't think of a way out of it. We're all guilty of it. But I draw attention to it because there is an alternative. And the alternative I came across recently in a small little book by Tyson Lewis, who offers a different reading that releases education from instrumentalization and opens space for an appreciation of futility as an element of education and a condition of being human without using the word. He doesn't use the word futility. That's my word. And one day I'll talk to him and ask him what he thinks about it. And I suspect he'll find it a little too grim. But Lewis asks, what if we took a radically different approach? One that does not see Arendt's exclusion of education from the vita activa as an oversight, but as an insight. And the insight for Lewis is twofold. First is that education no longer has to hew to the logics of the categories of the vita activa. So education then, if we set education free from existing for the sake of labor, work, and action, we can start to think of it instead as maybe a type of labor, work, and action. But to do this, we have to think differently about labor, work, and action. So we have to think educationally about labor, work, and action. And so to help us sort of think about this, Michael Oakeshott is actually a useful reference point. Education is one of the ways the shared world is maintained. It's how new generations are introduced to the work of humankind, so through these cultural artifacts, these things that we share with students. And it's how we learn about human interaction, the modes of human understanding that Michael Oakeshott writes about. So these would be sociological modes of analysis, philosophical modes of analysis, political theory, literature, all the disciplines and the sort of inheritances of modes of human understanding. They're all worth initiating young people into. And the important thing about this is that we are not insisting that students produce these kinds of analysis. We might ask them to do such a thing. We might ask them to engage in exercises where they engage in a literary analysis or do some political theorizing. That's the gradable stuff. But the point is not to turn them into political theorists or philosophers, but it's a more ephemeral and, to be sure, sort of futile exercise that the student can engage in, practice, exercise, make visible to us in this moment of judgment. This is my thinking about this text at this moment in time. And then we grade it. And then the grading is a part of what about this? And let's think about this. And what about cutting out this section and going this way? And the process of thinking begins again and again. So what Lewis values about education and what I think Arendt values about education and where I think Lewis is such a deeply Arendtian thinker, even though he comes from this other tradition of Agamben, is that he does not see education as a mirror of these other spheres of the vita activa. He sees education as the sphere in which these activities can be set, can be made available, can be put not to use, but to futility, right? To this kind of sense of disuse, misuse. And Lewis has some lovely language for this. He says, we can think about education here as a form of release from prevailing norms and expectations. So he puts this labor as not labor. So labor as maybe not depleting and just this cycle of consumption and relaxation. Labor as this different kind of educational activity that you're all familiar with because it's what you do every time you write a paper or a chapter or try to, God forbid, publish something. Work as not work. So this is work that has, again, issues in a tentative product, not something new added to the world necessarily, but a kind of practice, right? Sort of released from the imperative to perform and succeed and be an adult, right? Sort of enter the adult world, the real world, not this kind of distinctive educational space. And then similarly, action as not action. So this is very different than the critical perspective that would sort of set education, like put education to use to transform our society and sort of tackle problems of injustice. I am with David Blacker on this. I think social injustice needs to be tackled, but education is not the place to do it. Education is the place to understand it. The rest of our lives is where we take on this kind of action. So following Agamben, Lewis reminds us that education can be a space that preserves the ability to be and not to be, to do and not do. In that sense of looseness, we're not doing nothing, but what we're doing is not the doing that we're expecting in the real world. That is akin to Arendt's insistence on preserving the capacity for natality rather than seeking to activate it and instantiate it in educational spaces. So Lewis's educational inoperativity is another way of thinking about educational futility. It's an antidote to our narrow emphasis on utility. Now, study is Lewis's term for such an education. And those of you who have read Lewis will know that what he has in mind here is not necessarily the solitary student in the musty library, lonely in the book, losing themselves in the book, although I quite like that image. He's thinking of a more communal engagement of students who are, as he puts it, not afraid to be stupid together in these spaces of release into education. Now, I've collapsed two concepts that need to be distinguished. The futility, to talk about the futility of education is to suggest that education is no longer a worthwhile undertaking. This is not what I'm wanting to say. Educational futility may better get at what I want to convey. The paradox of educational futility invites attention to the way in which education seeks to stave off futility, as well as the ways in which education must embrace a certain amount of futility in order to avoid becoming overly instrumentalized. So the paradox of futility, as I'm thinking about it, offers a way of thinking about why we teach what we teach. We ask questions like, what is worth remembering? What has been forgotten? What is being retrieved in our decisions about what to teach and what to leave out? It also offers a way of thinking about about education for its own sake that can, I think, stand up to the charge that such an approach is only for elite and privileged students. While this is certainly the case currently, what we're seeing in the world right now is only the kids who can afford the $95,000 a year tuition at the places that are now shuttering their doors, tragically. And the Ivy Leagues are getting this kind of education, right? Have the leisure to engage in this kind of education. Everywhere else, humanities departments are being cut. So this is where we are right now. But it won't always be this way. The disappearance of work will draw attention to the predicament of under and unemployed people with time on our hands. Without wanting to instrumentalize this concept too much, I think facing up to the futility of education, as I've tried to explain the term, could be a way to counter deaths of despair. So then again, this gets us back to the therapeutic dimensions of education. I don't want to go too far with that, although I do think there's something profound in it. And for an example of this way of thinking, there was a fabulous article some years ago in the Atlantic Monthly by Derek Thompson. He's written a lot about workism. And this was about the predicament of unemployed people in Youngstown, Ohio, which is about an hour from where I teach. And Youngstown hasn't recovered from the collapse of the steel industry in the 1970s. It's a lot like Hamilton, Ontario, right? It like just hasn't bounded back. In this article, Derek Thompson examines the lives of unemployed people And he categorizes them into these 3 C's. So he talks about the consumers who have only time on their hands and they're just consuming a lot of TV and they're on the internet all the time. And they're a real serious worry because they're susceptible to political extremism. And then there's another segment that I think we'll be familiar with first before any of the others, which is the category of the contingent worker who actually has no free time. They're always trying to cobble together the search for the next thing. They have no leisure time. And so there's a different kind of problem. And then the final C category that he looks at are this category that he calls the creatives. And the creatives are interesting because they have time on their hands, and so they've gathered together. They've created essentially circus schools. So they've created these maker spaces in various cities and towns, Toledo, Columbus, Cincinnati. Youngstown has one too, where people come together to just do things for no reason, not to sell, not as a business incubator, although the way the maker spaces are marketed to governments to invest in them is by saying they will be an incubator. But who can buy the products if they don't have money, right? So that's a sort of an interesting pragmatics, I think, of those kinds of spaces. So that's the situation. That's the sort of the therapy of education. At some point, we're going to have to figure out what to do with people who have time on their hands. And education is as good a place as any, I think, to begin. Now, just a couple of points before I finish. One is, this is not an either or kind of argument. It's not either we have thoroughly instrumentalized education with qualification all the way, even if there's no job at the end of it, or we have this leisurely education. Most good teachers create environments that do all the things, right? So we're doing a bit of civic education, a bit of sort of qualification, sort of job preparation type stuff. And if we're really good at our job and have the confidence and courage to do this, we also create spaces in our classrooms where students are released into education. There's a very beautiful film that I'm not able to get in the US anymore called Herr Buckman and His Class. If you can get it in Canada, I highly recommend it. Has anyone seen it or heard about it? It's a German documentary, Herr Buckman and His Class, 3 hours. And so you have to give yourself over to the time and the screen, right?
Like the horizon. Like the horizon.
And there's a teacher, and it might be significant that the teacher's toward the end of his career, he's tired, he's thinking of retiring. And it's a German school, it's a German middle school, mainly immigrant students. So they're doing a lot of the pragmatics that education has to do. Students are mostly immigrants or children of immigrants. They're doing a lot of sort of civic socialization, like welcome to Germany. We had this thing called the Holocaust. We're still grappling with it. You need to grapple with it too. There's a lot of that. It's very powerful. They also have a very tracked system. So in middle school, it's being determined which of the kids will go on to the academic high school and which will go the vocational track. And so the teacher understands that he's part of this machinery, and he tries, as all good teachers do, not to track the students too narrowly, but also not to give false promises. He's very encouraging to the student of all their interests. You want to be a barber? Yay. Good. And he has a bald head and he says, you want to start with me? You can practice. It's very, very sweet. He's doing all those pragmatics. But the entire school year is, again, punctuated with these beautiful moments where the teacher is playing guitar and the students pick up various instruments around the class and they just sink into the rhythm of playing music. And that's a great example of release into education. It's not a perfect example, because in both of these examples, the circus school and Herr Buckman's musical interludes, these are sort of non-academic activities. These are physical activities. It's playing music. You can almost see Arendt glowering in the corner saying, but this is progressive education, this is play, this is not good, right? And I hear her and she's absolutely right. But if we take those moments, I think I just microaggressed. If we take those moments as analogies for education, those are the moments when the students can be reading poetry, discussing poetry, reading novels, reading any of the kind of intellectual work that we have in fact begun to set aside because it's not used. We're going to do that in the report. AI can give us a summary, right? I think I am almost at the end. So, to conclude, so Neil Vallely of the Futilitarian Condition book asks whether a sense of futility can be the basis of a political awakening or a new sensibility. He suggests, and here I agree, that it can, insofar as it gives us a way to name what we are feeling. This language, he writes, is not necessarily spoken. It can also be, as he puts it, an affective correspondence between lived bodies that generates a mutual recognition that does not require enunciation. Education can follow suit.